Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you all to this evening's session, webinar on a very important and a topical subject. Since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we have been worrying, discussing, and debating on its impact on the health issues, the economy, and some dramatic changes in the societal norms. However, one very vital issue, which perhaps failed to attract its due importance, is the interplay between the pandemic and pollution. Coincidentally and significantly, today, the 7th of September, is observed as the International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. And perhaps we could not have chosen a more important day to emphasize and create awareness at all levels how important clean air is for health, productivity, the economy, and the humanity. This evening, we have amongst us two young protagonists on the issue who have been working and researching on the broader issue of environment and more specifically on clean air. And it is our pleasure and privilege to welcome Ms. Shibani Ghosh and Dr. Santosh Harish, both fellows of Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Thank you so much, Madam and Dr. Harish. Before I request Mr. Indranil Banerjee, member of the Executive Committee of CMA, to formally introduce Dr. Harish and Ms. Ghosh, a request to you viewers. Our guest speakers have expressed the desire to make the session as interactive as possible. So please post your questions on the chat box and they will be very happy to respond to the extent possible to your questions either during their presentation or at the end of their presentation. Over to Mr. Indranil Banerjee, please.
Thank you, Mr. Badua. It is proud privilege to be part of this particular webinar session of Kolkata Management Association. This evening we have two scholars with us, Dr. Santosh Harish, who is a fellow of Center of Policy Research, New Delhi. Santosh's research interests lie in the areas of energy, environment policy, especially distribution of electricity and regulation of air pollution. His training is in quantifiable policy analysis methods and statistical analysis. Previously, he has been Associate Director Research at the India Center of Energy Policy Institute at University of Chicago and a postdoctoral fellow with Evidence for Policy Design, India and JPAL, South Asia. He received his PhD in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University, an undergraduate degree in Metallurgical and Materials Engineering from IIT Madras. So that was Dr. Harish, and we have another scholar, Shibani, Mrs. Shibani Ghosh, who is a public interest lawyer and fellow at CPR. She specializes in environmental and access of information law. At CPR, she researches on issues relating to domestic environmental law and regulations. Mrs. Ghosh has been a sustainability science fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a visiting faculty at the Terry University and RICS School of Built Environment, where she taught environmental law. She is a Rhodes Scholar and holds both the Master in Science in Environmental Change and Management and a Bachelor in Civil Law, a graduate degree in law from University of Oxford. She has an undergraduate degree in law from National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata. She was previously associated with legal initiatives of Forest and Environmental, a New Delhi-based environmental law firm, and has also worked as a legal consultant with Central Information Commission, a quasi-judicial body set up under Right to Information Act 2005. In 2011, she was awarded the first DOPT RTI Fellowship by Department of Personnel and Training, Government of India, to undertake research on the implementations of Right to Information Act 2005. So I request both the scholar to take it forward. I do not want to stand in between. Thank you, madam, and thank you, Dr. Harish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And thanks to the Calcutta Management Association for inviting us to join. It's really an honor for us. So, as it was previously mentioned, entirely by coincidence, today is the first international day for clean International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. Uh, After a resolution in the General Assembly of the United Nations in December last year to celebrate the September 7th as the International Day of Clean Air. So yeah, the day could not have been more suitably chosen. What we are going to do is, as was mentioned, we would love to keep this as interactive as possible. So we have a presentation that should take us about 30 minutes to go through. Um, and uh, and yeah, so please do keep sending in your questions in the chat box, and once we are done, we'll try and take as many of them as we can. Right. So over the course of this talk, what we'll try and do is answer two broad sets of questions. First, as we recognize that folks who are listening to us here may have different levels of familiarity with air pollution, we'll try and do a quick overview of the scale and scope of the problem in India. And subsequently, we'll talk about, in fact, Shibani is going to talk about how the COVID crisis has affected air quality efforts in the country. The first message I think that we would want to leave with you is that air pollution is a problem that, unlike what may be suggested by the media discourse on the issue, air pollution is not just something that is Delhi specific. It's not something that is restricted to even cities, and it's not restricted to winters alone. Right. Air pollution is a pan-India, around-the-year problem. It is specifically much higher in the Indo-Gangetic belt, as you can see from the map here. But the pollution levels really throughout the country are quite high across the year. Um, Over the course of this talk, you will find that we'll focus primarily on a pollutant called PM 2.5. PM stands for particulate matter. 2.5 refers to the size. So basically, these are particles that are suspended in the air, having a diameter of 2.5 microns or lesser. Very, very fine. And because they're that fine, that they can enter the sort of systemic circulation and reach various organs in the body. So you have particles of various origins, of various chemical compositions that manage to enter our system, and as a result create enormous harm, as we'll talk about in just a bit. 83% of Indians live in areas that don't meet the national standards. Right? Soak that number in a little bit, right? Given how we talk about it as, a few cities, 8 out of 10 most polluted cities in the world are in India, and so forth. But the number that really should alarm us is the fact that nearly, in fact, more than 4/5 of the population is exposed to very, very unhealthy air. In North India, this number goes up as much as 98%. In South India, and by North India, we just mean in terms of latitude, right? In the South, the levels are much better, but even there, the majority of the population is exposed to very poor air. One of the challenges that we often sort of find as an obstacle to the air quality discourse is that, well, India is a developing country, and therefore, of course, we need to be investing in our industries, in our power plants. Yes, we are going to have more vehicles on our roads, and sure, that's going to lead to air pollution, but that's just a temporary thing, right? That there's this notion that India can develop now and clean up later, and indeed, in the case of the West, that is part of the story. That's how they went about doing it. The trouble is, of course, that even if we compare, right, with the other country that is sort of in the news all the time for very poor levels of air quality, China, the population distribution that's exposed to very, very dirty air is skewed to the right. So as you can see in this graph, you have a much higher fraction of the population that is that is exposed to air quality that is 7, 8, 9, 10 times the safe levels. Whereas in China, you don't have nearly anybody at those levels, right? So Indian cities already at our current state of development are more polluted than our Chinese counterparts. So we can't possibly make the claim that we'll make it a little more polluted while we grow, and at some point we will clean up. We just don't have the luxury to do that, right? Why do we care so much about air pollution? I mean, how bad can it be really, right? 1.2 million premature deaths a year have been attributed to air pollution, right? So these are various health ailments, various health outcomes that air pollution makes worse. And to sort of give you a sense of how bad it is, this particular graph compares, for the same types of diseases. So you have lower respiratory infections, you have diabetes, lung cancer, cataract, really a host of very different things, right? So if you compare air pollution with tobacco use, you will find that the impact of air pollution is at least as bad, if not much, much worse across each of these different outcomes. The main problem with air pollution, in fact, with particulate matter, is that it affects nearly every organ of the body. It introduces toxic elements, toxic compounds that have no business being part of our body. It introduces them inside, and it allows, and given the size, these particles penetrate deep into these organs, resulting in these various outcomes. Right. So we talked about air pollution more generally, and how 83% of the population in across the country is exposed to levels that are much higher than the national standards. Now, how does Kolkata fare? So this is data from 2019 for one of the monitors, which is in Ravindra Bharati University, and it shows the concentrations over the course of the year for two pollutants, PM10 and PM2.5. Now, as I mentioned earlier, PM2.5 are particles that are less than 2.5 micron, really, really fine. PM10 refers to particles that are less than 10 micron. So that's sort of the superset of the pollutant that we are concerned with. PM10.2, I mean, in general, it's the fineness of the particles and the compounds that compose these particles that are the problem, right? So PM10.2 has various health ailments, but as the particles get finer, we have more of a problem. So in Kolkata, the pattern is what you would typically expect, in fact, across the country. You have pollution levels that spike during the winter months. They gradually recede during the summer. When it rains, it's the cleanest. In fact, right now, most parts of the country are going through through the cleanest phase. And then it picks up again as October, November come by, right? So if you look at the levels themselves, the average over the course of the year at this monitor, for instance, is almost twice what the national standards are, which is obviously a matter of great concern. And as you can see, during certain months, those levels are much, much higher. The blue and red line here show the daily standards, the daily acceptable levels as per the national guidelines for these pollutants. As you can see, for nearly half the year in the case of PM2.5, and for even more than that for PM10, the levels are much higher. Right. So what are the sources of air pollution? In fact, if I don't show you that graph, perhaps the first answer that will come to your mind would either be vehicles, or it would be industries or power plants, something to that effect, right? In practice, the single largest source of outdoor PM2.5 exposure in the country is household burning of solid fuels, of biomass, for cooking, for heating, for lighting, not so much for lighting, but for cooking and heating, kerosene for lighting, right? That's the single largest source. Across the country, you could say that 25% to 30% of outdoor exposure, mind you, this is separate to exposure indoors. We know that the indoor air pollution levels are very high because folks are burning, firewood and dung and so on for cooking purposes, and therefore it's bad indoors. But eventually, those pollutants go out and lead to 25 to 30% of average outdoor exposure. The other sources are, as you would expect, industrial coal, power plant coal. Transportation, you might have noticed, is a very tiny fraction in this particular graph, but this is because we're talking about the contributions on average across the country. As we talk about individual cities, the contribution of transportation goes up significantly, typically to the effect of 20-30%. Right. The other thing that I want you to note here in this graph is that the shaded sort of part of these graphs is for deaths attributable to PM 2.5 in rural areas. So if you were under the conception that, the misconception rather, that air pollution is a largely urban problem, unfortunately, that's not true. In India, average rural exposure and average urban exposure are nearly equal to each other. So yeah, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Right then. So one of the things that often happens, and so this particular graph plots the relative contributions of different sources for air pollution in Delhi. Now, Delhi is the most studied. Delhi's air pollution is the most studied by far in India. And what often ends up happening is that because of different assumptions in these studies, because of different times of the year where they're conducted and so on, the results may change a little bit, potentially leading to some confusion. But if you look at sort of this summary that we have put together here for you, you'll find that basically all of them converge to the following fact that each of these sources play a very important role, to the effect of 15% plus or minus 5% or so. And therefore, to see meaningful improvements in air quality, we need to be able to tackle each of these major sources in parallel. We can't really sequence them in any way, right? Given the types of health impacts that we've just discussed, we need to be able to tackle air pollution with a certain sense of urgency. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to tackle each of these sources in parallel. One thing that I sort of forgot mentioning when I was talking about health impacts, when we talk about infections like about about being vulnerable to infections like COVID, right? Air pollution will almost certainly make it worse. It will either make it more likely that because of the various comorbidities that it causes, makes you more likely to catch an infection, or it makes the severity of the infection much worse. With COVID-19 itself, the evidence is still emerging. We don't know enough, but what we do know from previous types of coronaviruses, and indeed other types of such infections, is that air pollution exposure will only make it worse. In fact, possibly much worse. So that's something to keep in mind. Right then. We talked about how there are multiple sources and we need to be able to tackle all of them in parallel. Another thing to keep in mind is that air pollution is, a regional problem. Significant contributions come, within a given city from outside administrative boundaries, outside city limits, potentially outside even the states themselves. This is a graph once again, for contributors to air pollution in Delhi. Delhi is, of course, unusual because it's sort of sitting in the middle of this Indo-Gangetic plain in some sense. It's couched between Punjab and UP, and therefore is obviously exposed to all of them in terms of the various sources that emanate from these states. But the larger point always holds, if you look at these graphs, you will find that you have some sources that are natural, so basically very fine dust and so on from sandstorms, but that's a tiny fraction, really quite small. Uh, you have all of our usual suspects: power stations, household sources, waste burning, agriculture, things like that. And these come from different places within a particular state, from neighboring states, from long range transport within India, so states that don't necessarily share the same boundary, and even from outside India to some extent. And therefore, when you think about how do we tackle the problem, yes, we need to tackle various sources in parallel, but we must also not restrict ourselves to within sort of conventional administrative boundaries. So if you look at the pie of sources affecting air pollution in Kolkata, you find a similar type of story, right? About 20% of the problem is from outside the city limits. And then you have various fractions: industry, waste burning, dust, vehicular exhaust, all of them contributing in this range of 10 to 20%. And therefore, you need to be able to respond to all of them. And this is something that makes air quality management in India particularly hard, right? You have three broad types of sources: those that can be attributed to energy access, extensive use of solid fuels among poor households, right? You have poor state of public services that ends up contributing to air pollution. So I'm thinking about waste management, I'm thinking about public transport, the maintenance of roads. And then you have the modern economy sources, okay, which are increasing over time. And here we're thinking about industries and vehicles, power plants, and the Western experience of air pollution and air quality management is largely restricted to this third source. The first two types of things they had already dealt with by the time, early in the 20th century, when they realized that this is something that's very harmful. And so this makes the challenge in India that much harder. So what constitute our air pollution control policies? You have three major pieces of environmental legislation that ultimately form sort of the foundation of our regulatory efforts: the Water Act, the Air Act, and the Environment Protection Act. These provide the framework, and they give various powers to the central and state pollution control boards. However, as we've already discussed, these are equipped better to deal with point sources, industries and power plants, which are sort of, once again, in that typology that we just discussed, the modern economy type of sources. Whereas things like household sources or public services, these aren't, as well, as clearly under sort of their jurisdiction in terms of your day-to-day management. And so here is where the National Clean Air Program that was launched in January 2019, here's where it plays an important role. Right? It expanded the ambit of serious air pollution efforts in the country beyond Delhi and industrial clusters alone. Right? So it identified 102 non-attainment cities. Eventually, this got extended to 122 cities. It provided a reduction target of reducing air pollution levels by 20 to 30% in 5 years. Each of these cities had to develop an action plan, and it called for interagency, interjurisdiction coordination to respond to that issue that we just discussed. Right? Limitations, as already as something you should have guessed, given sort of the background that you've been given just now, is that we are still talking about cities. The NCAP is largely city focused. It ignores rural areas. It ignores that regional lens, and therefore is naturally going to have that strong upper bound on how much you can truly accomplish. And it has some other sort of fairly common pathologies, right? So there's a certain lack of prioritization. Which are the most important efforts that we should focus on? Which are the most important sources that we should focus on? Who is responsible? You have a whole host of agencies that need to take responsibility, but where does the buck stop, right? It does not necessarily resolve structural factors that inhibit enforcement. If you believe that industrial emissions regulation has been weak and the pollution control boards have poor capacity, what does the NCAP do? very unclear. So if you take the case of Kolkata, right? So Kolkata is one of the big cities that are in this non-attainment list. It was allocated a fairly paltry sum of rupees 10 crores for 2019-20. And as you would expect, modest budgets, we get modest outcomes. The types of interventions that were funded through this allocation included sort of conversion. I don't know to what extent this has actually happened in practice, but one of the things that was being targeted was converting roadside eateries from coal to LPG. And then you had what are, sort of fairly standard band-aids, right? So you have water sprinklers, presumably to help dust settle, and then you have mechanical street sweepers to tackle road dust. Mechanical street sweepers to some extent can be useful if they are deployed scientifically, but as you should guess, these are very, very modest interventions, and that's part of the problem. There are limited resources. These are large problems. We need early wins. We have to prioritize better, right? And there are issues to actually be able to do this prioritization exercise. In most parts of the country, several knowledge gaps remain. There are multiple factors to consider, which we'll discuss in just a bit, and you need to trade off across these. What are these different factors? You need to, of course, account for the potential for impact, right? If you need to know how much a particular source matters and how much a particular intervention can affect change if implemented perfectly. But there's also the question of implementation capacity. Sure, something could have a high potential for impact, but what are the implementation challenges in terms of the capacity of a particular agency, in terms of the information available to that agency and to the public to hold that agency accountable? What's the political economy of this particular intervention, right? We need to think about economic costs. As you just saw, if you have a limited budget, then there are only that a fairly limited type of interventions that you can finance. So you need to be able to optimize for that too. And finally, and something that can often get neglected, is who does the program affect? Does it leave vulnerable groups worse off? And if it does, then perhaps that's not something that makes the most sense. In fact, in the case of Delhi, that was a major challenge. Overnight, auto rickshaw drivers had to change from diesel to CNG. And that was an expensive retrofit, and so that led to various challenges that were largely borne by a very specific, ultimately quite vulnerable group. So that was an effort to give you an overview of air quality management and the nature of air pollution in the country. As many of you have probably experienced quite directly, air quality levels over the last few months, and especially shortly after the lockdowns were introduced, improved significantly, right? And Kolkata is sort of a fairly standard story. What happened? You can see how PM 2.5 levels dramatically reduced, PM10 levels dramatically reduced. Nitrogen dioxide, which is a very good marker for vehicular emissions in particular, reduced a lot. Much more than the other pollutants, right? And so you have a similar story across the country. My colleague Shibani will now take you through, how do we think about these changes, and in general, what the COVID-linked disruptions mean for the air quality work in the country. Thanks.
Welcome, Shibani, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. Thank you, Santosh. Okay. Well, is this great? Thank you, and thank you for inviting us and having us over for this talk. I'll just take off from where Santosh ended, really, kind of now focusing almost directly on the interplay between the pandemic and air pollution is. And of course, Santosh hinted at some of these points of where these two issues really do come together. A report that we did at the Center for Policy Research, which is available on our website as well, we kind of explore ways in which the pandemic has actually created both opportunities for improving our air quality management in the country, but as well as also I kind of created, increase the risks of environmentally regressive outcomes. And we thought it'd be interesting to kind of discuss both the challenges as well as the opportunities for a new and enhanced agenda, which I'll just do in the next 5 to 7 minutes. Before I jump into that, I mean, obviously we all know that, and I just noticed someone in the chat box has also mentioned that during the pandemic and therefore the lockdown, we've obviously experienced fantastic environmental quality gains, not only, you see the blue skies, and we all are experiencing much better air quality, rivers are cleaning up, but it has been at an unacceptable cost. The economic upheaval that has led to this is something that we would hope and pray never happens again, and we certainly cannot work under the assumption that it will continue. It's been a temporary, certainly a temporary improvement in environmental quality. And in fact, as we the economy limps back in some sense, we're already seeing some of those gains falling apart, and the air quality is coming back. Of course, as Santosh mentioned during his presentation, that around this time of the year, due to monsoons, we, in any case, due to natural conditions, benefit from better air quality. But just to say that the lockdown improvements, or the improvements due to lockdown, are certainly untangling or falling apart. But as we mentioned in our report, and we'd like to discuss this, is that to achieve this kind of improved air quality, we don't need this kind of an economic upheaval, and there do exist more sustainable pathways to do so. And we think that the COVID crisis and what the response to the COVID crisis has been and is likely to be actually creates some of these opportunities for us. So just to, so what are those new opportunities? And I highlight 5 of them. First of all, as Santosh mentioned in his presentation, the household sources for, household sources of air pollution are really the single largest cause for exposure to air pollution. Therefore, the government's scheme to give free LPG cylinders to people who most need it during the lockdown is actually a move down the right way, because it would perhaps in some way target the Ujjwala scheme of the government to people who deserve it the most. And we think that this should be taken forward, ensure more vulnerable groups are targeted, and more increased subsidy or entirely free LPG is actually given to them, because that will have huge air quality gains, both indoor as well as outdoor, and also, of course, pushing for ensuring that LPG becomes a primary cooking fuel. Of course, there's a huge debate, as you all know, that's not just providing the LPG cylinder, but also ensuring that's used as the primary cooking fuel. The second opportunity is actually transitioning away from paddy, particularly in the states of Punjab and Haryana. As some of you perhaps know, that in the months of October and November, the spike that we see in northern India and the air pollution is a significant part of the spike is due to the stubble burning that takes place in Punjab and Haryana. But around this time, what's happened is, due to labor constraints, farmers in those 2 states have been forced to move away from paddy, because it's otherwise a labor-intensive crop. And therefore, one could hope that there could be other ways in which farmers could be incentivized to move away from growing paddy and towards towards crops which do not need this do not have these burning stubble burning requirements, and are therefore environmentally more benign in a sense. And that would require not just technological fixes such as happy seeders that the government has traditionally been supporting, but also creating a market for them, incentivizing crops like maize, just supporting the farmers and ensuring this transition away from paddy. And we think that the pandemic has shown people the possibility of doing so. The third thing is to scrap old and heavily polluting vehicles. As we know, the auto sector as it is isn't doing too well. And therefore, in some ways, if the government comes up, and it's imminent, as we understand, that the government is coming up with a new scrappage policy. And we hope that this policy will be properly focused towards old and commercial vehicles, which are even more polluting, so that there could be a shift towards cleaner, newer, more efficient vehicles. And that could be something which is quite beneficial. Fourth, many of us during this lockdown time have started working from home, and doing various Zoom calls or whatever it were has become acceptable. It's fine not to kind of have to come to office. And I think that kind of a nudge towards kind of behavioral change, which will ensure that we use our private vehicles less, use cabs less. I think those kind of measures also need to be encouraged so that vehicular emissions come down. We can't say how much, but we do think this kind of a behavioral shift in the long term is something that we should move towards. Finally, retiring old thermal power plants. This is something the finance minister also had mentioned in her speech. But we do have significant number of power plants which have been identified as those that should be retired now due to inefficiencies. And that would basically make way for much cleaner, more efficient thermal power plants. And already that power sector is not doing well financially. And therefore, to align the financial as well as the environmental outcomes would certainly be beneficial. Now to just come to what we think could be potentially regressive outcomes, and that's something we really need to look out for and worry. The first and foremost, of course, is that given that our economy has taken such a hit and has been taking a hit even before the pandemic broke out, there could be a possible, well, there is a push towards, improving the economic environment, the policy environment for businesses, but it should not come at the risk of diluting environmental safeguards. And therefore, there needs to be a pushback from the civil society and other stakeholders that, yes, we need economic kind of progress. Economically, growth needs to be pushed up, but it should not be at a very, very huge cost of the environment. Here, I'd like to mention, I think, that there has been an ongoing debate on the draft EIA notification of 2020 that's been out for public consultation until earlier last month, and how this notification does risk diluting environmental safeguards and environmental regulation significantly. And just a few ways in which we do that, we don't have to go into detail there, but it does have an impact on air quality, particularly in regions which are critically polluted and which are industrial or mining areas. The EIA draft EIA notification is going to dilute the level of environmental scrutiny that's going to take place. It's in fact going to exempt some of the projects which are likely to have significant environmental harm or impact. Those are going to be entirely exempt from any form of scrutiny. Public consultation is going to be, or at least has been, the way it's been proposed, is going to be restricted in some ways. Also significantly, the quality of decision making has been made poorer. For instance, the appraisal committees have less time. There's no mention of climate change considerations. So there's several ways in which the draft EIA notification is going to impact the environment. And that, of course, in large part would include the air quality of those areas in which the projects or development activities are going to come up. The second way in which we think that the pandemic is going to, may lead to poorer or regressive outcomes is the non-compliance with the power plant emission norms, which actually came into place in 2015, and by 2017 they should have already been complied with. But as it happens, the deadline has been pushed to 2022. And research shows that almost 70% of the power plants will not be able to meet the deadline even by 2022. But these are unacceptable delays because there is enough and more evidence which shows that the health outcomes of having these polluting power plants which are not meeting emission norms are unacceptably high. So the government should not be seen as providing a tacit approval, as it were, to these non-complying power plants, and should certainly push for ensuring that emission norms that are very much in place are met as soon as possible. Weaker regulation on the whole. Because of the lockdown, several pollution control boards have issued notifications which kind of push back on deadlines and dates, such as renewal of consents, inspections, required regulatory inspections. All of that has been pushed back because of the lockdown, because of lack of personnel, lack of resources. So all of that has got pushed. But what we need to remember is there's a reason why those consents need to be renewed, or these places need to be inspected, is because we have to ensure that they meet certain environmental norms, prescribed emission standards, and all of this cannot be given up because of what we are facing. And in fact, we need to be even more careful and cautious about how we go down this road. And finally, over-reliance on private transport. Many of us would be under the impression now that public transport might be something that would increase our risk to infection. And buses, the seating in buses is lower. Metro in many cities has not started. Delhi, in fact, has just started its metro, restarted its metro today. And therefore, there might be a shift towards private transport because people want to save themselves. But we have to be careful that this should not be used as a moment to spend more on infrastructure like flyovers and road widening, which tend to reinforce reliance on private transport. We need to ensure that the infrastructure related spending is more on ensuring sustainable mobility infrastructure, which kind of encourages public transport. Finally, just kind of putting it out there, in terms of the money, I mean, Santosh mentioned how Kolkata has just got 10 crores under the NCAP, but the Finance Commission recently has said that it's allocating 4,400 crores towards municipal corporations in cities, in about 40 odd cities, so that they can use that for air quality management related issues, which is a lot of money, in fact, much more than the Ministry of Environment's entire outlay. So this fund allocation, though it so far remains unaffected, but we are all seeing how, the fiscal federalism as of now is breaking down. There are obviously a lot of friction between states and center on the GST issue. If we don't know where it will go as far as the fund transfer is concerned, and obviously local agencies such as municipal corporations are hard pressed with personnel who are very busy at the front line of the COVID crisis, but they also may not prioritize air quality related issues. So we need to somehow keep up the pressure to ensure that air quality doesn't go on the back burner, because it's absolutely urgent. We do not have the luxury to postpone this for a later time. But so all of this would require kind of a coordinated effort, particularly at a regional level. And we'd like to kind of leave you at that all this, and as the earlier presentation also talked about, has been very much city-centric. But we all really need to move towards the regional airshed management kind of an approach, where a whole area, so for instance, the Indo-Gangetic Plain entirely, all the states and cities which come within it, have to be regulated at one through a consistent and uniform regulatory framework, rather than looking at it from a city-centric point of view. So just by way of conclusion, just certain points you'd like to put out there, quite eager to get all your response and feedback. We know enough right now to act with urgency. I mean, some of the numbers that we already have, 1.2 million deaths attributable to air pollution. We can always keep doing more research and create more knowledge. There's no doubt about that, but we know enough to kind of underline the urgency in the problem. Each source, and there's several like transport, industry, power plants, household sources, waste, all of them have to be tackled at an appropriate level. We cannot prioritize one over the other right now. All of them are significant sources, but this prioritization has to be done strategically, and therefore including kind of keeping in mind the factors that Santosh did mention in his presentation. And lastly, there has to be a systematic approach, and it is not something that only one stakeholder can do. We actually need kind of a trifecta with the public kind of focusing its demands to what it thinks the government should prioritize based on good information and data and a solid knowledge base. The executive at all levels, the center, the state, municipal level, local level, they need to show some form of commitment, because many of these are long-term measures which require the government to commit to things which may not be politically very palatable and may be very expensive, but certainly with fantastic public health outcomes in the long term. And finally, very important, that the regulatory capacity, for instance, personnel in pollution control boards, in the ministry, or in municipal corporation, people who understand and are able to implement environmental regulations and have the adequate power to be able to do that, all of that together has to come, has to happen for us to achieve or at least see some form of gains in air quality governance and management. So I'll end here. Thank you so much. We'll be very happy to answer questions and feedback. If you could just put that down.
Thanks, Shibani. It looks like we have a few questions. Perhaps we can take them one after another. One question here is about from Shantanu Chakraborty, asking whether we could explain the impact of lockdown on air quality and pollution as a whole. Shall I take that, Shibani? Basically what happened during the lockdown was that you had a whole series of sectors that affect air pollution sort of being artificially switched off as sources. So this includes vehicles in particular. I mean, I think some of the most drastic reductions have happened as a result of all of us staying at home and not driving so much, and in general, not buses not plying on the roads and so forth, right? But you also have the impact of industries and power plants either not operating or operating at much lower levels, which has played an important role. That said, it's worth pointing out that it's not the case that we have had like these we have had sort of a homogeneous set of reductions in pollution levels across the country. For example, in industrial areas, the impact on PM 2.5, the impact on things like sulfur dioxide, which is directly a result of burning of coal, these haven't been affected significantly. So the cities which depend on a larger region, and the larger region would typically include things like household sources playing a larger role. Household sources were completely unaffected as far as reductions are concerned. In fact, it's likely that household air pollution went up because you had poor households perhaps relying even more than usual on solid fuels, given sort of constraints in terms of cash at hand. So cities and regions that are affected by air pollution from a larger catchment area, from the larger airshed, tended to see lesser reductions than those cities that were largely whose air pollution comes largely from within city limits. So it's really quite interesting, and also helps us understand better what sources contribute to air pollution in different parts of the country, especially where that knowledge base does not exist at the moment. Shibani, Mr. Ram S has pointed out that due to the air pollution levels have come down drastically all over India during the lockdown. This is a welcome sign. Due to the improvement in the air quality, birds have started flocking to the water bodies. Dolphins have staged a comeback in some places. Post-COVID, the same trend should be continued. COVID has therefore come as a blessing in disguise, at least as far as reduction in pollution levels is concerned. Do you want to sort of respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I was mentioning in my talk as well, yes, you're right. Because the industries were shut down, of course, the emissions level came down significantly. But unfortunately, they're not only going to go back up. What concerns us is that some of the regulatory checks on the emissions from some of these industries might actually get diluted over time, particularly if the government is keen to kind of facilitate ease of doing business. Some of these industries may not, will actually perhaps enjoy some dilution in inspections, consent requirements. So it's going to be harder now than ever before to push for an agenda of clean air from industries, if I could say that. And it's been kind of not lucky, but I mean, the way it's moved, that after the lockdown, we are now in this kind of monsoon season. So we feel that the improvements of air quality has just continued, but actually perhaps if it weren't monsoon, we would see the improvements disappear much faster than they have. So if we had to actually, if this was November, I think Delhi would be very close to its levels of pollution as it saw last year and the years before.
We have another question here, which is about what's the impact of medical waste on air pollution, especially in view of the fact that the system of bio-waste disposal is very poor in our country, and with COVID. Proper disposal of bio-waste has become very important. Absolutely, this is very, very relevant, especially now that we are also disposing of our masks, and you have a lot of biomedical waste that is getting accumulated. This has impacts potentially at 2-3 different levels. One, in general, the constraints on the waste management infrastructure, right? Will likely mean that there is greater open burning of waste happening than before, which is something that could sort of have the net effect of increasing, which would lead to an increase in pollution levels, and something that maybe we have not noticed because all the other sources were switched off. Obviously, the heart of the waste management system are the waste collectors themselves, and the disposal of bio waste has put them at very high risk of exposure to COVID. I see your question is on e-waste management in India as well. I think the final sort of interaction between waste management and air pollution that is probably also germane here is that in terms of two things happen, which I think are especially important. One, a significant amount of waste ends up getting incinerated in waste to energy plants. This is an incredibly harmful source of air pollution in cities, because the types of emissions that may result may not always be well regulated. I mean, there might be certain types of pollutants where we don't even have appropriate standards. These are not always meant to be waste that are burnt without significant pollution control equipment installed. The second way in which waste management at sort of the fag end of that cycle works is that you have, especially among e-waste, a large fraction goes through informal recycling plants. So basically you have it's almost like a cottage industry where people are working under very, very unsafe conditions, and typically end up using acid and so on to be able to recover the most precious parts of e-waste. In Delhi, for example, the chloride levels as a result of various types of these informal industries are an order of magnitude or so higher than what is deemed safe and what is observed in virtually any other part of the world. So there's definitely these many different ways in which waste management and air pollution interact with each other.
Santosh, there's a question from Major Indrajit Banerjee about East Kolkata. Sir, I do hope you meant wetlands, because that's and not wastelands, because and I point that out because the government itself often decides to call very, very critically important wetlands as wastelands, and that's the so East Kolkata wetlands and Sundarbans are facing an environmental calamity. Fisher folk are migrating to different parts of the country. Bengal Pollution Control Board be doing? It's an extremely important issue, and I'm glad you bring it up. It's not just the West Bengal Pollution Control Board, but also other agencies such as the Ministry of Environment and the Department of Environment and Forestry in West Bengal. They certainly have to stop granting clearances and consents to any form of industrial activity or so-called development activities which has negative adverse consequences to the environment in these parts, and more importantly, as you perhaps know, a lot of this is unregulated construction or unregulated activity, which is not something that the government gave consent to. And in these cases, the government agencies have to proactively enforce the law and hold the polluters or the violators responsible, because that is an essential problem in our environmental governance across the country, is the lack of accountability and the inability of our government agencies to enforce the law. If they do find someone kind of violating the standards, or illegal construction or encroachment on what, and wetlands and sundarbans are absolutely ecologically so precious, particularly in times of climate change, the agencies have to proactively stop people from encroaching and deter future violations. And the problem is that the punishments, or what happens if you're not complying with the law, is not enough to scare people off. They just think that, oh, we can just get away with some kind of a slap on our wrist, or no one will notice, no one can do anything to us. So those are the kind of things, accountability and enforcement of the law, that agencies need to work towards.
There are a couple of questions here which I think I could take together. One is, I request the organizers to please let us know, because we are coming dangerously close to the 8:30 mark. But perhaps I can quickly respond to Manindranath Mekli and Vibhav Bhatia. So the first question is, what's the status of Kolkata regarding air pollution compared to other metros? So compared to Delhi, or for that matter, Mumbai, air pollution levels in Kolkata are actually, compared to Delhi for sure, Mumbai not as much. Kolkata is certainly better off, but we are sort of really comparing ourselves with sort of the worst in class here, right? And so the levels are, as I showed in that graph, for PM 2.5, it's in some locations it's more than double the national standards. So yes, it's not as bad as Delhi is, but that's hardly something to aspire to. It's bad enough, and is a serious issue, and something that's worth taking very urgently. There's another question here on how there's a popular belief that traditional solid fuel used at home is better than the less polluting alternatives in terms of health benefits from food cooked on them. This is almost certainly a myth. In fact, there's very, very little scientific evidence you would find that this is true. And the levels of air pollution indoors especially is just so very high that even outdoor air pollution seems like a walk in the park. And as a result, given these enormous impacts, I can say with certainty that cooking food on chulas with the traditional solid fuels is extremely harmful. But this question also points, and I think it hits the nail on the other major challenge. I mean, when we talked about it, we were primarily talking about subsidies and so on, ways to make fuel use cheaper. But there is also a very, very important set of behavioral and awareness campaigns that need to be run. Because this belief is indeed very, very popular. It's very widely held. So you have folks who can actually afford LPG and so on, ending up using solid fuels for certain types of food because it's felt that it is going to be healthier and tastes much better. So that's a challenge. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so perhaps we can wrap this up here.
May I request Indril Banerjee, Executive Committee member of Calcutta Management Association, to kindly propose the formal vote of thanks. Sir, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Anirban. Yeah, it was a great session altogether. So many new tech at personal level. I work for one power sector, and I know the value of air pollutions. So that is one issue. But I am to record vote of thanks. I first record. Give thanks to Dr. Harish and Madam Ghosh for the fantastic session. It was very value-adding for participants. We had around 150 turnout. I also give thanks to our past president, Nasir Fonji, the executive committee, the attending participants, as well as GNIT Food Technology Department for their support to have this value-adding session altogether. Thank you and good night on behalf of Calcutta Management Association.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.